Joining us now in Potterville, Michigan, where Trump has returned to the campaign trail, is NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. Also with us is the Atlantic staff writer and MSNBC political contributor Mark Leibovich. So, Vaughn, you brought this to our attention yesterday. Truth Social is not a space that a lot of Americans see because it doesn't have a large following. And the campaign, according to reporting, has kind of felt good about that because it allows Donald Trump to off-gas some of his wilder things. Except this is getting out into the public domain. How is the campaign explaining what he's promoting, from QAnon to this idea that a woman only got her job because of a sexual favor to a man?
Right, Katie, I think we should be clear that the campaign doesn't try to explain it, and instead they put on events like this one here at a steel plant in Michigan and tout it as being an event that's going to focus on steel manufacturing and jobs in Michigan. And you said that there is a very specific base of individuals who follow the Truth Social, the media platform of Donald Trump. And for those individuals, they are looking at content that is different than the Trump campaign is tweeting out on X, if you will, who Donald Trump about 2 weeks ago joined that platform, but it's different content. And on that Truth Social account, Donald Trump, he reposts content frequently. Last month, he called for the public military tribunal of Liz Cheney. And again, you said it, calling for the prosecution for sedition and perjury of January 6 select committee members of Congress, calling for the military tribunal of Barack Obama. We should note the sexist and degrading post that you mentioned there about Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. Interestingly, if you will, this afternoon it appears to have been unreposted, yet that was up for about 24 hours. And it's not often that Donald Trump takes down anything, but he didn't take down any of the posts in which he called for the prosecution and the arrest of Jack Smith. And this, I think it's important here. Our job, as you have on the campaign trail, Katie, is to cover the Republican nominee for President of the United States. And while some may dismiss this as being social media reposts of memes, at the same time, these are words of Donald Trump and speech of Donald Trump. And if he were to get back into the White House, he would have a Department of Justice where some of his strongest allies have called on him to use it in a way that it's been untraditionally used in decades past. And that would be to have more authority over the actions of his attorney general. And he could very well order his attorney general to investigate and even seek a grand jury to prosecute and bring charges, an indictment against the individuals who these social media posts suggest he should bring charges against here. And so I think that there's a lot of outstanding questions that Donald Trump is yet to, frankly, face, Katie. And these social media posts, I think, are the most insightful into the mind of Donald Trump because in real time, they are happening from his keyboard. And 2 months out, I question here the extent to which the campaign, who, as you noted, they don't respond, they don't dismiss this, they don't put his name on an intern, as they tried to do in 2016 for making these posts. These are, for all intents and purposes, the speech of Donald Trump just through the medium of social media and memes.
The speech of Donald Trump, we're seeing all of these reposts. When he does actually talk about what he wants to do when he's in office, what does he say about his political rivals? How far does he go personally when he's talking about what he wants to do or what he believes he has the right to do?
On stage, he says that the district attorneys who are prosecuting him, others from the Department of Justice, should be investigated for their actions, calling it political lawfare. And he openly has suggested that there is cheating in the election of 2020, and he's already laying the groundwork that there is election interference, which online he has suggested amounts to being illegal ahead of the 2024 election here. At the same time, he's not as explicit verbally as he is on the social media posts. For instance, 2 weeks ago at Bedminster, I was able to get one quick question to him where I asked him whether he would order his attorney general to drop the two federal cases, the election interference and the classified documents cases against him. And he said he did not want to talk about that right then, but he called them nonsense cases. Of course, over the last 24 hours, he's had multiple social media posts in which he has explicitly said that the federal cases against him and the indictments and the charges against him should be dropped here. And so I think that's an outstanding question that journalists that have the chance to question Donald Trump will assuredly be asking him over these 2 months. And of course, I think the anticipation would be that we would hear some of these questions to him at the debate on ABC in 2 weeks, and potentially a third debate, which Donald Trump has previewed on NBC later on this month, Katie.
Yeah, and Mark, I don't want to amplify the derogatory nature of these social media posts or the conspiracy theories, but I do think it's important to be clear about what he's saying and to not sanitize Trump himself or not clean it up for the viewing public, because the viewing public are the people who will be deciding how they want to vote in November. It was the same, calculation that we had in talking about Donald Trump in 2016 with the Access Hollywood tape. And it's been, a calculation that we talk about it feels like often when it comes to what Donald Trump says regarding a whole host of stories. Is it different today? Is it different today? Going into this election, is he more responsible for his words among voters today than he used to be?
One would like to think he was. I mean, one would like to think he was when the Access Hollywood stuff came out. I mean, this is, there's been a pretty low standard that he is held to from the beginning, and obviously his supporters will forgive him for a lot of things. I think what's interesting, though, is, like 2016, like Access Hollywood, he's running against a woman again. 8 years is a long time. It's also a lot of Trump. It's a lot of things to be exhausted over. And look, he actually does, if he wanted to be a disciplined candidate and a disciplined campaign, there are three pretty core issues he could be sticking to. It's the economy, it's inflation, it's immigration, that we are not going to be talking about today, no matter pretty much what he says today, because it's Arlington, it's these Truth Social posts, and you just know that if there are cooler heads and more responsible heads that are prevailing inside his campaign and fellow Republicans who clearly know better but aren't going to say anything, they have to be exasperated by this, because this is another wasted news cycle, if you will.
Is the Arlington story kind of on par with the way that he's being derogatory toward Kamala Harris? We heard him early on go after John McCain. I don't like losers, like the people who don't get caught. This is him at Arlington Cemetery. He's in a space that the Pentagon says Arlington says he's not allowed to be in with a camera for political purposes. The family did invite him in there, but the family of the other grave, the man who was in the other grave that also got photographed, is upset. They don't want to be a part of a political campaign. And there are veterans that are certainly fans of Donald Trump, but there are other veterans who say this is too much, it's too far. And now there's news from the Pentagon that there was a physical altercation, that one of the Arlington employees, a woman, was shoved, they say, by a Trump campaign aide. Shoved, physically assaulted.
Yeah, it sounds like, obviously, we're trying to figure out what's going on here, but it's an outrage. It's an outrage in the same way that, look, this is hallowed ground. This is not where political things, let alone, calamitous ones like this, are supposed to take place. You're not supposed to tell, sacred, John McCain's war service, suckers and losers. Go down the list. This is stuff that would have theoretically ended the career of any other politician, to the point, until Donald Trump walked on the scene of all this. So, yeah, again, it's a familiar story. I do think, though, that it is framed in the context of 8 more years of this, a lot of exhaustion, and also an opponent that not only is she a woman, but also someone who is running a very kind of different tenor of a campaign. I do think that the Harris campaign has been pretty deft in not taking a lot of the bait here, not sort of amplifying it any more than it's already been, which, has been pretty, I think, detrimental to Donald Trump potentially, but also just sort of continuing to sort of pound on a joyous campaign, not focus too much on Trump as maybe Biden did, and sort of hope that it propels you forward as it has this summer.
Offer an alternative. Mark Leibovich and Von Hilliard, thank you.